What's up guys, Jay's 2 cents here, and I've been asked to do a video like this quite a bit now over about the last week. A lot of people ask me to put together a $1,200 build guide because a lot of people are looking at taking that stimulus money and stimulating the PC economy by building a new $1,200 machine. So if you're gonna find yourself potentially $1,200 fatter in your bank account, well, I'm gonna help you try and spend that money today. You know what, guys? I got new merch. It's available now, crowdme.com/Jays2cents. We got zip-up hoodies, we got tri-blend, we got a new logo. I digress. Since 2012, it's a digress logo. You guys have been asking for that. But anyway, we got all kinds of stuff. Zip-up hoodies, beanies, polos. Don't take my word for it, because obviously I can't do this ad. So just look in the description below and you guys will find the link. Thanks. Okay, so rather than do two videos, one for Intel and one for AMD, I'm gonna go ahead and give you guys two guides in a single video. Now, for the most part, these parts are gonna be the same. When it comes to the, not really peripherals, but the extra parts, the accessory parts, if you will, like the power supply, the case, graphics card, stuff like that is gonna pretty much be the same. Because to understand how I do my build guides, you have to understand the way I kind of budget out the money, and then it will sort of make sense. I also want to caveat this in saying that I haven't really been watching a lot of YouTube tech videos lately, so I have no idea if other YouTubers have done this particular content piece already with guides on how to spend 1,200 bucks. So if someone has, then do me a favor, just take this video and use it for food for thought on how I would spend the 1,200 bucks, depending on Intel or AMD, and then compare it with other people that may be doing the same type of build guides, and then maybe mix and match and see what you guys can come up with. I think there's 50,000 different ways you could build a $1,200 PC, and these are just the ways that I would do it if I were building, let's say, for someone that said, I have a $1,200 budget and I want either an Intel or an AMD rig. These are the parts that I would actually purchase and build. So let's go ahead and start with Intel. And the reason why I'm gonna start with Intel, no, I'm not an Intel shill, as much as many of you may believe that, it's because I find Intel to be the harder brand right now to shop for. Because, quite honestly, the value isn't there. And even though $1,200 may seem like a lot of money, believe it or not, over the last month or so, there has been a rise in cost and a reduction in availability of certain parts of the PC build that is making it a little bit more difficult than it would have been, say, a month ago to build these systems. There's a slight amount of cost inflation. Power supplies specifically seem to be expensive and out of stock across the board on many, many brands. Things are a little bit more inflated than they were. Now, I say a little bit. If I had to make a guess here, I'd say things are maybe 10, 12% more expensive than they would have been prior to all of this stuff going on. Now, when it came to the CPU, and that's kind of the first thing I try and decide is, what's the point of the system? Gaming, productivity, general use, whatever. In this case, we're gonna talk gaming, because gaming computers also make great productivity computers. But general purpose computers generally make terrible gaming computers. And let's face it, if you're stuck inside, you're gonna wanna play some games. Maybe this is your first gaming computer, I have no idea. But when it comes to Intel, i7 and i9 were completely out of the question. In terms of cost, the only i7 I would personally recommend would be a 9700K. Intel's come up with some lower versions like the 9700F, and I feel like my audience is going to be interested in potentially tinkering with the core clocks. So having a K SKU would kind of be the only one I'd be interested in. But to be honest, at $379 for that CPU makes it a terrible, terrible value at an 8-core, 8-thread, non-hyper-threading CPU that is still going to need approximately $150 to $200 motherboard to get full value out of. So that already made it very difficult. So if we're going into the idea of gaming, I chose an i5 9600K for the same reasons I just said. You can overclock it, you can tinker with it. It's got 6 cores, 6 threads, no hyper-threading, which means temperatures will be in check. I'm almost positive you can get the CPU to 5 gigahertz. And it comes in at just under $200 at, well, $199.79. That's still under $200 technically. So it's a Coffee Lake 6-core, 3.7 gigahertz, 4.6 gigahertz base clock, 4.6 gigahertz turbo clock. That's a single core, by the way, I think up to 2 cores. But for the motherboard, that's the other thing, is a motherboard's an easy place to throw away money. And we don't want to do that. So I chose the Asus TUF Z390 Pro. Now there is also a Z390 gaming Wi-Fi, which is the same cost. One's wireless, one's Pro, but they're the same price. I just threw the Pro in the cart. You could choose between which motherboard you want, wireless or the additional Pro features, which is very, very little. But at $169.99, it's gonna give you, I think, a really good value in terms of getting you Z390 chipset features as well as overclockability. Now we could have gone with like an H370 or whatever the nomenclature is, but again, we are pairing this with a K SKU, which means you are going to want to go at least with a Z series motherboard. Now, if you did go with an H series motherboard, you could do a 9600 non-K, save a few bucks on both the motherboard and the CPU, but you're not going to get the fun of tinkering and overclocking. And if you want to really maximize your FPS in your games, you're going to want to overclock at least a little bit. Now, when it comes to memory, this is what's kind of exciting. And I keep looking down because I have my list on my phone, obviously. Memory has gone down significantly in price. For instance, for both of these build guides, I chose the ADATA XPG series GAMMIX, G-A-M-M-I-X D30 memory. And the reason for that is a dual 8GB dual channel kit. Oh, and by the way, the motherboard I chose does have 4 DIMM slots, which means expandability in the future. A lot of cheaper motherboards only have 2 DIMM slots, which means if you want more memory, you've got to switch out all your modules with larger modules. Neither of these builds would have that problem. But this is DDR4 3600 megahertz memory CL18. Now you could tighten those timings if you wanted, but you really don't have to. We kind of did a video recently showing how just going with faster memory clock yielded us a pretty decent amount of FPS with a 2080 Ti, mind you. 3600 megahertz is pretty fast for mainstream desktop. And considering the fact that it's only coming in at, what, $74.99 or 75 bucks, getting 3600 megahertz memory at CL18 is a very good value. You're gonna find a lot of other brands were more expensive than that with slower memory. Probably tighter timings, but slower memory. And what we're doing here, I think this is gonna be a great value kit. It's got a nice looking heatsink on it. It's got no RGB. It comes in black or red on the top trim, but it looks nice. It's gonna run cool. It is overclockable. It's compatible with both Intel and AMD. And so it's not going to give you any problems there. Now, when it comes to power supply, I feel this is an area some people might give some pushback on my lists. I have an $87 power supply in here, which is the Corsair CX series CX650. Now, you might be looking at this going already, Jay, why a 650 watt power supply? Well, one, you don't know which graphics card we've chosen yet, but two, because power supplies are a component that can last you a long time and they can mature with your system. You can upgrade your system, go with a bigger graphics card or a bigger CPU, and then you don't have to change out the power supply. I feel a lot of people will buy a power supply that is perfect for the system they built with no room for improvement in the future, which means if you're going to upgrade anything, you need a better power supply. Also, to build quality. A lot of people really underestimate how important a quality power supply is when it's single-handedly powering all of your components. And if that part fails, it can take components with it when it dies. If let's say the 3-volt rail, something goes wrong there with the voltage regulator and suddenly it's shooting 5 or 12 volts, God forbid, down your 3.3 volt rail, you're gonna have a bad day. And yes, it's happened. I've had plenty of people message me telling me that their power supply took out everything in their system. It's unfortunate, but if you go with the right quality of power supply, then you're gonna find that that's not gonna be something you have to deal with a whole lot. Now, this is an 80 plus bronze power supply. An 80 plus white is the minimum I would go with because it still adheres to the 80 plus standard, which means better quality components. But you can obviously scale up or scale down the power supply as you see fit. The problem is power supplies right now seem to be something that has gone up in price over the last year consistently with like the whole embargo, or not the embargo, but the tariff stuff. Power supplies really seem to get hit hard on that. Now let's go and talk about the graphics card. This is interesting because we've talked about graphics cards in the past. There is a huge overlap. There is a massive overlap in terms of graphics cards. I'm not even talking about AMD. Intel alone. You've got 2060s that cost more than 2060 Supers. You've got 2060 Supers that cost more than 2070 Supers in some instances. And you've got regular 2070s that cost more than 2080s depending on the brand you go with. So it's like, what the hell is going on here? Now, because of the parts that we chose and we decided not to go with an i7, it saved us some money to get us a better power power supply too, but graphics card. So I went with the Zotac Gaming GeForce RTX 2070 Super Twin Fan. It's a pretty no-frills card. It doesn't have a custom name. It's not like a, their Arctic freezer and blah, blah, blah. It's a pretty basic card that I believe even has limited overclocking available to it with very limited power limit slider on there. But I would much rather go with a fairly bare bones 2070 Super at the cost that's on this particular chart, which is $509. It's not a cheap graphics card by any means, over a similarly priced 2060 Super. Even an overclocked 2060 Super on its best day is not gonna be as strong as a 2070 Super. And yes, this card does still have some overclocking available to it. Just because the power limit slider might be very limited, doesn't mean you can't still add more core clock until you start to get crashing and stuff. It's a dual fan, it's gonna be quiet, it doesn't have gaudy RGB all over it, which means it's just a black dual fan with a backplate. It looks nice, it's clean, it'll match any build. And it's a 2070 Super, which we already know will decimate 1440p gaming, has RTX features, DLSS 2.0, all that stuff. So it's gonna get you a better gaming experience than a 2060 or 2060 Super. But Jay, what about the 5700 XT or the 5700? Well, if you go and use your benchmarks and compare those graphics cards to the 2070 Super, you're gonna find the 2070 Super is pretty much faster across the board, only by a few percent in some instances, by a lot of percent in others. But my issue with AMD still at this point is its driver issue with the 5700 XT. It has improved, and the 5700 as well. It's improved over the last few months, but there was a while there where it got rough, where even the AMD subreddit was full of people talking about why they're ditching their AMD graphics cards because of how bad the drivers were. Driver updates that would completely break games and make them unplayable. That was games that were working just fine on their previous versions. So I'm still adopting the wait and see before I start saying 5700 XT or 5700 is worth it. We're also kind of waiting to see what happens with Big Navi later on this year. But it's kind of been the same story with AMD in terms of making great hardware and software support. So I'm still hesitant to recommend it until I see the drivers no longer filling up Reddit and Twitter and everything else with people telling me, and even my own YouTube comments telling me how bad they've been. Now let's go and talk about storage. This is another area I seem to get a lot of pushback. $1,200 is a decent budget. And if you don't do an SSD at $1,200 budget, you are doing yourself a disservice. I've showed a million times, the fastest way and the quickest way and the cheapest way to wake up a system and make it feel faster is get off a spinning hard drive and get onto an SSD. Even a 2.5-inch SATA 6 gigabit per second SSD is gonna decimate and dominate any spinning drive, whether it be a hybrid or not. So that's why in this instance, I've chosen the Team Group GX2 512 gigabyte SSD. Now, you can actually get a 1 terabyte for under $100, but the problem is we're starting to go over budget. So I would take the 512 gigabyte SSD, put your OS on it and your favorite couple of games, and then leave some headroom on the SSD, and then get yourself a 2 terabyte Seagate Barracuda hard drive. Now, a lot of people go, oh, I don't like the Barracuda. Well, you can kind of take that budget and apply it wherever you want. But for 50 bucks, a 2 terabyte, 7200 RPM, 64 megabyte cache hard drive that isn't responsible for running the operating system will handle all your games just fine. You would just want to put your larger games that take a long time to load on the SSD. And that's the way I would handle the storage. A single SSD with a big hard drive to back it up. It's kind of been a foolproof plan that I've used in all of my customer builds and friends and family that I've built CPUs or systems for. I've never had them complain. And even a few people that I did do like some paid builds back in the beginning of my YouTube career, I did the same thing. No one ever had a problem with it. The thing is, once you're running an operating system on a spinning drive with other programs that are loading, it has to seek all over the platter when the operating system's running, as well as loading those programs. Once you have the system on an SSD, everything wakes up, even the hard drive. And then last but not least, the case. It doesn't leave us a huge budget for a case, but I chose the Fractal Design Focus G, and the reason for that is it has a decent aesthetic. It's available in multiple colors. No, they didn't sponsor me to say this. I spent a while looking around on Newegg to try and find exactly what case would work with a $1,200 budget that doesn't take away from money available to the rest of the build but still gives us a decent case to look at. Because if you spent $1,200 on a system and you're looking at some bare beige box, which is now black these days, but a bare beige box, you're gonna be a little bit depressed. You want to look at your computer and feel proud, like, hey, that's my PC. I play games on that. I do all sorts of cool things on there. I'm excited to look at it. I walk in the room and it makes me happy. If the case doesn't do that for you, no matter what's inside, I think most people would agree with me that looking at it and seeing the awesomeness is just as important as knowing it's awesome inside. So yeah, there are people out there obviously that are like, I don't care, put it in a cardboard box, and that's perfectly fine too. But at $49, the fact that you get two LED fans in it already, most basic cases at this price point would only come with a single fan, plenty of mesh ventilation, it's gonna fit all of our stuff in there, it's a full ATX case, but it's a mid-tower, so it's not too big, and plenty of expandability for extra fans for cooling, then that means we're gonna be able to get the job done. Now let me tell you what going with Intel didn't allow us to do. It didn't allow us to add an additional CPU cooler, although the box cooler for 9600K would be fine for some minimal overclocking and even some decent overclocking on the stock fan should be okay. It didn't give us money for additional case fans, and it didn't allow us to go with a bigger SSD. And we still are technically $3 over because it's $1,203 US. Now, I didn't include tax or shipping or any of that stuff because I don't know what the situations are. Everyone's tax situation is different. This is just the listed MSRP price of the components that add up to $1,200. So you're probably gonna have to add a few bucks here and there. But if you found $1,200 extra of stimulus money, I'm sure you could find an extra $50 or $100 to put into this to cover those extra things. All right, so when it comes to AMD though, what do you get? Well, in my opinion, when it comes to AMD, you're gonna get an extreme value. See, back in the day, we used to say AMD is a great value, but at the cost of performance. That's not the case anymore. So this system is fairly identical with only a handful of things. One, I was gonna change the RAM out, but I couldn't get any other brands of RAM that were this fast for anything cheaper. So there was no point in changing it out. And although it doesn't say Ryzen on it, it will still work with the latest generation Ryzen CPUs. This isn't first gen Ryzen where only a few handful of DIMMs were validated with Ryzen. This is not your grandpa's Ryzen. So we went with the same power supply, we went with the same RAM, we went with the Ryzen 5 3600. It's a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, which means you're going to be able to do all sorts of multi-threading tasks. It's got twice the amount of processing threads that Intel does. When it comes to multi-threaded performance, it's going to absolutely mop the floor with the 9600K that we used in the Intel build. And for the motherboard, I went with the MSI Pro X570A Pro. The cool thing about that, it's a $159 motherboard that still is an X570 chipset, which is really cool because when X570 first came out, they all were like $300 and up. So finally, we've got some more mainstream, affordable X570 motherboards giving you the chipset features that you would want to use to expand in the future. Specifically, Gen 4 PCIe, giving you access to extremely fast storage. Well over 4,000 megabytes per second fast worth of storage. So in the future, if you wanted to add more NVMe storage, you could get yourself, they're kind of expensive right now, but maybe by the time you're ready, they'll be cheaper, some PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSDs, and then you would get an insane amount of throughput when it comes to your storage. I left the same Barracuda 2 terabyte hard drive on there with the same 512 gigabyte SSD, the same graphics card. I looked at doing a 5700 XT just to make it a full AMD build. I already explained why I'm not very comfortable with doing that in the previous section with the Intel. But if you wanted to go with the 5700 XT, you would actually save yourself approximately $100 over the 2070 Super. And then that would open things up for maybe getting an NVMe SSD instead of a SATA SSD. You could potentially even get yourself a big tower cooler for your 3600, or upgrade your 3600 to a 3700 and get even more cores, more threads, and then you would still stay within your budget. There's a lot of ways that you could, kind of be flexible here. But we left the same case as well with the Focus G, but this gave us some money to actually add another fractal fan in there that gives us a little bit more additional cooling. But really all we changed was the motherboard and the CPU because all the other parts are what I would leave the same. In terms of gaming performance, so between these two, it's possible in certain titles with the Intel 9600K overclocked, you would get a better, higher average FPS by maybe up to 10 FPS, depending on the title. So now that I've showed you how I would spend approximately $1,200 on an Intel and an AMD system, which one do I recommend at the end of the day? I'm gonna be honest. If you haven't already heard in the tone, the AMD system is gonna give you way more for your money. More cores, more threads, more performance, more multitasking, faster available storage to you through X570 chipset. It's one of those things where I kind of wish that they had an AMD graphics card right now that truly was a competitor for the upper tiers of NVIDIA, because then having just a full AMD system would be awesome. But what's the trade-off here? In some titles with Intel, you might find a slightly higher average FPS with this graphics card and a very fast clock speed of Intel. If you like enabled the all-core on Intel when you were getting like 4.7, 4.8 all-core overclocking on 9600K, on some titles you might find better average FPS. But what you're gonna get with AMD is a much more rounded, better computing experience, as well as gaming, that you're not even gonna be able to pass the blind taste test of which is Intel and which is AMD if they're 10 FPS different. The 2070 Super at 1080p or even 1440 is going to give you enough FPS to max out your refresh rate on almost any gaming monitor. Even 144 FPS for 1080p panels would be very capable with the 3600 and the 2070 Super. You're not going to bottleneck either CPU with that graphics card. But if you're one of those people that's like, I want to try live streaming, and I want to try folding at home, and I want to try all these things, like I want to render and edit videos, you're going to get a better experience with the AMD system than you are with the Intel. And at the end of the day, it's actually a little bit cheaper. The AMD system, even by adding the extra fan, came in at $1,197, so $6 cheaper. So guys, that's the way I would spend my stimulus money, if I were getting any, but that's fine. It needs to go to people who need it. And that's where I kind of ask you guys now, where would you spend $1,200? Would you change anything in this list? Do you think I've overspent somewhere or underspent elsewhere? So sound off in the comments below what you would spend $1,200 on either an AMD or an Intel system. And also too, you guys can check the links down below. Would be some Amazon links as well that help us out here through our associate links and such. They're changing things and trying to pay people less, but that's fine. I mean, we do all right, I'm not complaining. But if you feel like looking down below and checking out those links, you can, and then it will help us out either way. But guys, thanks for watching. Hope you guys are feeling well and being safe. And I hope everyone is doing okay up here. Being stuck in your home when you're being told to is not the same as being stuck in your home because you're a recluse and you just hate people. You want to be there because you want to be, not because people are making you. That's my problem with this whole thing.